Hi, we entered in Genesis 39 today, and as we do, it's a good opportunity to go back to look at some of the issues we began to consider when we entered into the beginning of the Joseph story, or the story of Jacob's family, as you can see on the first listed issue on the right side of the screen. So one of the reasons we have to do that is the previous chapter was not a part of the Joseph story directly. It was a story of Tamar deceiving Judah into getting her pregnant so that she could have a child after he sequestered his children away from her after her husband, his son, died. And so many scholars have seen that as an insertion between the stories about Joseph. But why? As I was noting in chapter 37 and through the last videos, those two chapters fit together very nicely. And what I'd like to show at the beginning of this video is how chapter 38 and 39 fit together, as well as the whole three chapters, 37, 38, and 39 as a unit. So looking at the issues on the right side of the screen, number 2, how does this section, not the whole section, but our immediate section, fit in with the immediate section here? And when and where was it written? And one reason that's going to matter so much is the presence of Egypt. And the question of when it was written and when Egyptian influence is relevant for the audience and for the readers, whether that's at the time it was written or at some later time. Because as we'll see in chapter 43, when Joseph becomes basically the regent of Egypt, he's given some things, gold, a chain, and a ride in the chariot, that back 1,000 years or more before the context of exile, which is what we mostly have thought the story is written at, following the rest of Genesis coming out of exile, that there were rituals like that. And so is this actually echoing what some scholars would call Egyptian historical fossils, remnants of a previous era? Much like if we had a story about the United States today, it might involve something like muskets, which are much more recent in the scheme of things than the rituals that are involved in the story, which could be more than 1,000 years earlier, the evidence we have at least from the time of exile. What if it's from a later time, though? One of the issues could be, what if it's from the time of the Seleucids, when Alexandria was an important city and the Septuagint was created there to translate the Hebrew scriptures into Greek? One argument against that is our text is in Hebrew. So unlike the texts that were written only in Greek, this assumes that the audience can read Hebrew, or at least that Hebrew is worth writing, at least to make it sound Israelite or Judahite, if you will. So probably not that late. And so one of the questions we're going to have to look out throughout is what the relationship is between Egypt and the Jacob family and the Israelites and the Judahites. And one theme that I've been noting in my series on the monarchy in the books of Samuel, and will come out more when that series gets to 1 Kings, which I haven't gotten to yet, is Egypt plainly had control over the region throughout the time of the monarchy. That the monarchy in Jerusalem was a function of the Egyptian larger imperial situation, although it's rarely mentioned in the Bible. But it is mentioned later, and so we'll see how that's a factor. So if it was an immediate factor at the end of the monarchy, and this is written either during exile or the time after exile, it might well be the memory of that experience with Egypt that what's at issue here. But we can't resolve it by just talking about it now. I just had to name that so we can be paying attention as we go. So let's look at how the three chapters fit together, and I arranged them in this narrative sandwich, which I'll note parallels a similar kind of sandwich in 1 Samuel. Where in 1 Samuel 24 and 26, Saul is chasing David and David's hiding out. And in both situations, David refuses to harm the quote-unquote Yahweh's anointed. And at the end, Saul calls David's son. So those are parallel stories. In the middle is the story of Nabal and Abigail. And again, scholars who are source-oriented think that's inserted, but there are many connections there. And in many ways, Nabal, whose name means fool, is a stand-in for Saul. So in our situation here, we see some of the parallels. We see immediately, as you see on the chart here, the question of garments being used for deception. And so the word for garment, beged, which is just the ordinary word for an everyday garment, is only 13 times in Genesis, but 9 times from 37:29 to 41:42. So only 4 times elsewhere in the whole book of Genesis. And we see it's involved in all 3 of these stories, where his brothers used his coat of many colors, so-called, his long sleeve coat, is another way to look at it there, to deceive the father by putting goat blood on it and saying, "Do you recognize this?" and having Jacob assume that his son was dead. In this situation, as we'll see, not in this video, but later in this chapter, Mrs. Potiphar, the wife of the woman that Joseph has been sold to, named Potiphar, so I'm going to call her Mrs. Potiphar, although another A feminist scholar wants to give her a name, and we'll look at that more when we get there, not this time. We see that there she will use his ordinary outfit, not his special outfit, for this purpose, to be deceiving here. And then in chapter 38, Tamar uses garments for deception to pretend she's a prostitute. And so we'll see that all those are common. And what's different here, and we'll look at the differences in just a minute, is I'll look at those differences in just a minute. Similarly, in 37 and 39, Joseph ends up in a pit, the Hebrew Habor, where his brothers throw him into a pit, which is probably more like a well there. And here in chapter 40, where Joseph will name it, and it's often translated as dungeon, but it's the same word, Hebrew Habor. So in our chapter 39, it's described as a prison, but it will be parallel there. And as you can also see, Jacob is ignorant of his son's scheming to harm Joseph. He falls for the ploy of the goat blood on the coat. And Potiphar is ignorant of his woman scheming to harm Joseph and falls for her charge that Joseph was trying to have sex with his wife. And in the middle case, Judah was ignorant of his daughter-in-law's scheming, which was good for his son's memory. And he almost has her burned before she reveals what's going on there. Another thing to connect this is the final verse, literally the final half of verse at the end of chapter 39 is this. Meanwhile, the Midianites had sold him, Joseph of course, in Egypt to Potiphar, one of Pharaoh's officials, the captain of his guard. And the first verse of our current chapter, as you can see there, now Joseph was taken down to Egypt, and Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, the captain of the guard, an Egyptian, bought him from the Ishmaelites who had brought him down there. If there was no 38, we certainly wouldn't need this repeated to be putting in there, and it's there to remind us of what was going on. So I'd like to say that we read all three of these chapters fitting nicely together, although there are parallels and differences when we just look at the preceding chapter 38 and 39. So three major parallels, and this could have been in more detail, but this at least covers the major points. In both, female characters, Tamar and Mrs. Potiphar, are seeking sex with a man in an inappropriate context. Both women use deception around clothes, and men's identifying objects, Joseph's robe and Judah's signet ring and staff, are left in the woman's control. But there are also differences, and the differences are important too for why that story is there in chapter 38, contrasting with the male story about Joseph. So Mrs. Potiphar has a powerful man behind her authority. Tamar has no man at all, highlighting that the woman's authority here comes from patriarchy, comes from a man's power. Tamar's actions subvert the status quo by undermining Judah's sense of superiority, as well as indicating publicly that he's gone to a prostitute, whereas Joseph's actions maintain the status quo. He remains, at least based on his actions, in his position, and no sex happens. Similarly, in contrast, Joseph's robe reveals identity. It says, "Isn't this the Hebrew servant that you brought in to mock us?" And we'll look at that later. And Tamar's veil conceals identity. Judah doesn't recognize his daughter-in-law. So some interesting parallels and contrasts as we enter into this. There are also many key words here, and I've translated it as I tend to do so you can see more literally. So, for example, the New RSV on the left side almost always leaves out, but not always, the repeated emphasis on hands. Hands is a place of power mostly, all that he had in Joseph's hands. So we see hands throughout. There's also an interesting shape that we see here, and many scholars note this, that Yahweh is mentioned at the beginning as supporting everything Joseph does, and Yahweh is mentioned at the end. And these are the only times in the Joseph story that Yahweh is mentioned at all. Some scholars see this paragraph at the bottom here as introducing the next scene in chapter 40, recognizing that chapters are not part of the original. And it could be read that way, but it can also be read as framing this here, that even though Joseph has faced Mrs. Potiphar's sexual aggression there and has fended it off, at least as far as he knows, and yet her husband finds out and is enraged and he ends up in the pit, things are still going well for him. So we see those parallels as well. And we also see, interesting, the line repeated 4 times, the long line in Hebrew. He left his garment in her hand and fled and ran outside. That's a long statement, and we see it's 4 times in there. So that repeated phrase that will be repeated again and again. So with that in mind, let's also look, one more thing is what we'll see in the as the story unfolds, we'll see the three lines of cultural conflict, and it's starting right from the beginning of the fact that he's in the house of the Egyptian master. So the ethnic national identity, the Egyptian versus Hebrew in quotes, because that's the word that Mrs. Potiphar uses, which is an ethnic insult in place of Judahite or Israelite. So the Egyptian Mrs. Potiphar to the Egyptian men of the house, as it is said in the Hebrew, original Hebrew, the closer to the original. See, my man has brought among us a Hebrew to mock us. So identifying is that we're all Egyptians here, and he's brought in a Hebrew against our ethnic identity. But when she goes to her husband, it's based on gender. Egyptian Mrs. Potiphar to Mr. Potiphar, the Hebrew servant whom you have brought among us came into me to mock me. So it's me against you, your servant against me, man against woman. And then finally, it's elite versus servants and slaves. When his Lord heard, that's Joseph's Lord, of course, heard the words that his woman spoke to him, saying, this is the way your servant treated me, he became enraged, and Joseph's Lord took him and put him into the prison, emphasizing the Lord and servant aspect. So those are the three lines of cultural conflict that we still face today, whether it's in terms of wokeness, as some would call it, or political correctness, as others call it, or simply justice, as others might call it, whether it's ethnicity and racism, gender and sexism, or classism here, all of these come up in this story, a very modern situation, and we look at it that way. So let's begin to enter into our story here. So Joseph was taken down to Egypt. And as my note below has from Wenham, the passive form of the verb, which is only two other times in Genesis, thus looks at the events of what we saw, 36:26, from a different perspective. And as Fackelman notes, the syntax at the start, without getting into the details of the Hebrew form, suggests that this is a flashback. Suggests a flashback, but it also suggests how Joseph, transported to Egypt like gum, balm, and laudanum, has become a mere commodity. So he's part of the shipment taken down there. And he's given to someone who's described at several levels here, Potiphar, who we'll see later has a name very similar, Potiphara, to the person who's the father of the woman who's the mother of Joseph's children in Egypt. I wonder if it's the same person or not, but he's never referred to again by name, only by the title Adon, which is translated master here, but is much more eloquently translated Lord, because Adonai is how God is referred to so often. So it's a power in contrast with God as Lord. So he's an officer of Pharaoh, a Sari here, which is a eunuch. Sari doesn't have to mean eunuch in all cultural contexts. It's the Egyptian cultural context that puts that on it. But it's common in many for a very clear reason. If an officer has children, he may well scheme to have his king or pharaoh killed so his children can get the power. It's not unrelated at all to in the Middle Ages where priestly celibacy was required, not because priests were above people in some sense of sexual purity, but for the same reason, so they couldn't inherit property through their children. So he's an officer of Pharaoh, and that's key here, that he's a eunuch, that signals to us that his woman is going to be sexually hungry, or at least sexually deprived. Whether she's hungry is a matter of her, but she's certainly deprived. And he's described as the captain of the guard, Sar Hadabakim here, and the Egyptian title, as Sarna notes, came to be a general designation for people attached to the services of nobles, princes, and kings. So he's an important guy, and in case we didn't know, he's an Egyptian. So he's an indigenous person there, unlike Joseph. As Western suggests, using older source theory, would expect this at the beginning of the description rather than the end. It is certainly that it is an addition, but it doesn't have to be. In the Hebrew text, it frames with mystery there at the end of verse 2, thus, quote, putting Joseph inside Egyptian authority, even with Yahweh with him, just as he's described as successful or prosperous. So in other words, his prosperity is taking place within a framework of Egypt here, taken down to Egypt, and he's in the text surrounded by Egypt. So that's the function it plays when we read it from a literary perspective, rather than assuming sources that have been woven together here. And bought him from the Ishmaelites who had brought him down there. And at the end of chapter 37, I dealt with the supposed conflict between the Midianites and the Ishmaelites, and I won't go back to that now. And then we hear, Yahweh was with Joseph. There's no particular reason given. One can infer because he's suffering, much like Yahweh is with the Israelites in Egypt, according to the Exodus, that Yahweh is on the side of people who are in trouble, the oppressed, the widows, orphans, etc. And so at this point, Yahweh is with Joseph. But what many readers, whether scholarly or otherwise, often leap to, and maybe the text expects you to leap to it but doesn't say it, is that Yahweh continues to be with Joseph when he rises up to power. But it never says that. So is it a function of Yahweh's with Joseph because he's Joseph? Is Yahweh with Joseph because he's an Israelite and Yahweh's with the Israelites? Or is Yahweh with Joseph because he's suffering right now and Yahweh's with those who are in need? We have to decide that as we go. Just as we'll have to decide about the character of Joseph. And as I noted in the introduction in chapter 37, when I taught this as an undergrad class, even students who were not biblically literate at all wanted to side with Joseph and see him as a hero. But there are many hints in the text and some not so hints, some plain big markers right in our face that say maybe Joseph isn't exactly a hero to the Israelites. But we'll have to see more of that as we go. So we'll watch carefully for the character of Joseph. But now Yahweh was with him, and he became a strong man or a prosperous man, an ish matzalecha here, and matches at the end of the chapter. And he was in the house of his Egyptian lord. And as my note below has, given its eventual use as a metaphor for dynastic power, house, as in the house of David, for example, and the temple which represents it, as in the house of Yahweh, as in the temple, it already suggests the contrast between Jacob and sons outside, seeking food inside empire. Much like Abraham and Sarai did back in chapter 12, and again in chapter 20, although that wasn't in Egypt. So there'll be many echoes of that story in chapter 12, as we'll see. So, his master or his lord saw that Yahweh was with him. Now, plainly not. As my note has below, not only can Potiphar not see that Yahweh in particular is with him, why would a high-ranking official in Egypt see, if he's wanting to, if it means by seeing, attributing causation, that a foreign god, a god of a people that Egypt sees as vassals, would be the source of his power, rather than Ra or other Egyptian gods? So that certainly is unlikely as a historical matter, but the text is suggesting that somehow he's seeing that this is coming off Joseph like an aura, and that Joseph's God is the one who's causing this. So he's drawing that inference, but it's very unlikely historically. And it continues with the causal connection there. So because of that, Joseph found favor in his eyes. So often the literal eyes are taken out from the New RSV, in his sight. As you note, the key words in this immediate section here, separate from the key words in the larger picture: house 4 times, overseer, paquad twice, and all that he had in those different combinations. So he found favor in his sight and attended him. Again, at 40 verse 4, and only these times in Genesis, attending. You notice what's happening in so few verses. He's gone from being someone who is a commodity, just being sold, to being seen as someone prosperous or successful, although we don't know exactly what that was, and we don't know how much time is going by. So now he's attending directly the captain of the guard, who's made him overseer of his house. Much like at the very end of the monarchy story, and there are other connections there we'll look at later, the Babylonian king appoints a local Judahite to oversee the temple on their behalf. So there, it's the foreign empire doing it in the local vassal place. Here, it's the foreign vassal who's taking over the house in the imperial place. Certainly, an exilic audience who knew 2 Kings would recognize that. So he's been given power here. And not only that, put him in charge of all that he had. Literally, all that was his, he gave into his hand. And that's repeated a couple of times, as you can see from my note below. And in case we didn't notice, the narrator is going to underscore this. From the time he made him overseer in his house and over all that he had, repeating this exactly, and a little symmetry there, Yahweh blessed the Egyptian's house. And the word for bless here, Virak, here is only here in the Joseph story outside the last chapters when Jacob has come to bless his sons and grandchildren. So, blessing the Egyptian's house. Notice it falls on the house, not on the Egyptian, nor on the Egyptians or on Egypt. It's simply on this house. Whether that means the whole household of Potiphar, probably, not literally a physical house. But it's specifically shown for Joseph's sake. Notice the narrator is the one who's omniscient here. It is indicating that Potiphar knows this is for Joseph's sake, although he could be inferring that as well. And again repeating it, the blessing of Yahweh was on all that he had. Notice the repetition here. All that he had, Yahweh blessed, the blessing of Yahweh and all that he had. Creating a little chiastic symmetry in this verse and in this verse. So two little repetitions to make that point. In house and field. And field added seemingly at the end, but that's going to be key to the whole business because Egypt's power is based on agricultural slavery and the Nile and the flow of the Nile. And so field will be key. And of course, in the Exodus story, it says the Israelites are enslaved, building storage cities for all the grain for Egypt. So we'll do one more part of verse before we stop for today. And so, I won't go to those notes down below from Apostle. We'll look at that more next time when we enter into the more of the Mrs. Potiphar element of the story. So he left all that he had. Notice the emphasis on all throughout our section here. In Joseph's charge, or literally in his hand, and with him there, he had no concern for anything. Literally, he knew nothing. As White suggests, this subtly suggests the absence of sexual relations between Potiphar and his wife. It could be, because yada there, used there, is often the verb for intimate knowing in the sense of sexual knowing. So is this implying that what I was inferring from being an Egyptian czar, that he's a eunuch? But the food he ate, and some suggest that's a euphemism for his sex, or at least for his private affairs there. But couldn't it also mean specifically what it says? Concern for eating with the Hebrew, which we'll see in chapter 43, is described by the narrator as an abomination to the Egyptians. So this last line here is clearly part of what follows here. I put it in the next paragraph, so that's where that ends up. So the narrator has given us quite a lot of information to highlight and underscore and repeatedly underscore Joseph's presence there is making everything bloom all around him. And within a few verses, we don't know how much time has passed, he's gone from being a commodity to being one of the most powerful people in the land. What could go wrong? We'll see where it does go wrong next time. See you then for that. Bye-bye.